Everyone, and welcome to our second of three topics for this week. We're going to talk about colonialism. Just a quick word about terms to start us off with. We're going to refer broadly to the countries in blue here as the global north and the countries in red here as the global south. As you can see, since the global north includes, for example, Australia and New Zealand, this isn't a perfectly geographically accurate description, but it does broadly give us the sense. In the past, other terms have been used. You might hear the West versus the East, the first versus the third world, where the countries in blue are the first world, red is the third world, and then the developed or the developing world. Those have fallen out of fashion for a variety of reasons, so we're using global north, global south. So I want you to think here about where your clothes are made. So most likely, for most of you, your clothes were made in China or elsewhere in South Asia or Southeast Asia, perhaps in Central America. And this is pretty amazing. For the vast majority of human history, everything that people owned was either made by them personally or by someone who lived very close to them. Maybe there'd be a couple of things that were traded from far away, but the vast majority of people's lives was made by people they know. Today, it's unlikely you have a piece of clothing made in the USA, maybe a couple, but the majority of them were shipped across the world. And the same is true for most of the things around you. The electronics that you use every day, just everyday things in your life come from all over the world. And in some ways, this is pretty remarkable. So let's think about what causes that. So this is the result of a system called colonialism. This is the system where one country takes control of another land or people. It began in the 15th century, Columbus being a classic example, and went until the middle of the 21st century, where it fell apart after the Second World War. We're really talking about relatively few countries here. The UK had 24% of the world's surface, the land of the world. Spain controlled 9%, France 8%, Portugal 7%. So as you can see, between those countries, over half of the world was controlled during this period. And they did this through a variety of means, through economic power, through military power, through cultural power. Here we have the British, who had the machine gun, unlike many of the people that they fought against. It's hard to understate how dominant a system colonialism was for the whole world. This is the world in 1922. The countries in red here were controlled directly by Europeans. So obviously this is all of Europe, but also almost all of Africa, South Asia, Oceania, Canada, the vast majority of the world. The countries in blue were independent, controlled by non-Europeans, mostly, as you can see, in Asia and the Middle East. The two countries in Africa on the east there, that's Ethiopia. If you like reggae music, you've probably heard of Haile Selassie, who was the king of Ethiopia, who kept it independent. And then in the west there, that's Liberia. That's an interesting country. That was actually founded by African Americans who were returning to Africa. And their idea was that they would create a place where people who had been freed or had freed themselves from slavery could return. And then the other set of countries here in orange, which you can see as most of Central and South America, and then of course the US, are countries that were independent but were still controlled by European settlers. So they were controlled by the descendants of Europeans. All of those countries had been colonies at one point, and while they become independent countries, the people that have control over them were the Europeans who had moved there. Just to give you another sense of how dominant this is a map of the countries that the British Empire went to war with at some point. The countries in pink here are the countries Britain has been to war with in history. The countries in white, which as you can see is a tiny number, is the countries that Britain has never been at war with. Colonialism consisted of an exchange. In exchange of natural resources, so resources in gold, diamonds, rubber, all kinds of things were extracted from the land and moved across the world. An exchange of labor, of the work that people was doing. This involved physically the movement of people in the case of the trade and enslaved people, but also work being done in one country, in the the results of it being brought to another. It also involved the opening up of markets, of places to sell things. The most famous of these was the British East India Company that controlled the opium market in China. It also involved an exchange of debt. A huge amount of debt was accumulated in the global south during colonialism. And overall, just a massive movement of wealth. And all of these things moved in one direction. They moved from the global south, the countries that were colonized, to the European countries that colonized them. So those resources were extracted from Africa, from South Asia. They were brought to Europe. Obviously, people were stolen from Africa and brought forcibly to colonized countries. And then the work of people in those countries, even if they weren't moved from country to country, the results of their labor were brought. The wealth from markets, the things that were sold and the products that were brought back, that wealth moved to the European countries from the rest of the world. And debt is very much still a legacy. There's many countries in the global south that are still paying off debts as a result of colonialism to the global north. Many banks in Europe and the US are still making significant amounts of money from African countries, from South American countries. And so overall, just money, wealth, value moved from the global south to the global north. All of this was about capitalism. You'll remember at the end of the capitalism video, if you were held in that long, I talked about how capitalism expanded, right? Capitalism started in England and then it exploded across the world. And the reason for this is they were looking for those resources. They were looking to control the means of production in more countries. They were looking for markets to sell things to. They were looking for people that they could force to do the work, whether that was at very, very low wages or forced in the case of slavery. They were looking for more wealth and they found it and they concentrated it. And again, the people that were able to do that were the people who controlled the means of production to begin with. It's also the case that during colonialism, there was a massive exchange of culture. This is a lot more complicated, and culture moved around in different ways and was combined, and new cultures were created and moved around the world. We're not going to go into depth about questions of cultural imperialism and cultural appropriation and so forth, but that's where we would discuss them here. Another map of the world in 1914. Colonialism was the direct cause of the First World War, a fight over which European countries got to control which parts of the world. So I said I would talk about settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is when the indigenous population of a country is replaced by the population of the colonizing country or people that have been brought there. So the US is obviously an example of this. Compare the US to, say, Nigeria. Nigeria was a British colony. It became independent. Britain left. And today, if you go to Nigeria and look at who's in power, who's the politicians, who are the people that run Nigeria, you will find they're people who are the descendants of the people who were in Nigeria before the British came, right? So the population of Nigeria remained more or less the same, descended from the same ancestors. And the British came, they controlled it for a while, and then they were kicked out and they left. But that's not what happened in the US, right? The British came to the US, they controlled it for a while, and other Europeans, obviously. And then the British were kicked out in the Revolutionary War. But who took control of the US after that? Certainly not Native Americans, right? The people, George Washington, who controlled the US after the Revolutionary War, the founding fathers, as we call them, were all descendants of Europeans, most of them descendants of English people, right? And you can see in this GIF here the way that the Native Americans were pushed from their land in huge amounts, right? All of America used to be Native American land, and the settlers took that over. So this is about a transfer of land. So the US, while it's not a colonizer country in the same way that the UK is, it is a settler colonialism country. This was done very intentionally. Here's an advert from the time of Indian land for sale, right? The people they're selling it to are European immigrants, largely fine lands in the West. They advertise 1910. This is when this particular advert was put out. And they even are quite explicit about whose land it is that they're selling here that's been taken. This is also deeply connected with the slave trade in the US, right? The reason there was a big economic interest in kidnapping people and enslaving them and bringing them to the US is that there was a lot of land that could be worked for profit, right? Again, that land was owned by the capitalist class. And why was there so much land? Well, because the Native Americans had been slaughtered or kicked off of it, right? So the slave trade and the Native American genocide, the expansion of settler colonialism, are very much connected. And the second largest population today in the US is African Americans, right, who are also a type of settler colonialists. They're obviously not descended from the people in power, Europeans, but they are descended from a movement of people that happened as a result of colonialism, as they were brought here forcibly during the slave trade. People in colonized countries responded to colonization in all sorts of different ways, and we shouldn't ignore the fact that they exercised agency. You'll remember that agency is the fact that as people we get to decide how to respond to and how to interact with these big social forces. In some cases they resisted, they fought back. In some cases they found ways to use colonialism for their own advantage. And many people who have been relatively powerful in colonized countries became more powerful by collaborating and working with the colonizers. Here is an example of a group of people from what is now India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, who worked with the English colonizers and were able to gain more power and prestige as a result. You'll see the English guy there in his coat in the middle of the picture. People also adopted cultures and created syncretic cultures, cultures that come together from more than one culture put together. One example for this, for example, is syncretic religions like Voodoo and Santeria, for example, which are a combination of Christian traditions and West African traditions. Jazz, rock music, blues is all syncretic, right? It took elements of European cultural music, right? The brass horns, the virtuosity of the leads with the traditional African drumming techniques, and combine them to a new form of culture that is uniquely African American that came as a result of that bringing together of different cultures. And then another result of colonization was nationalism. Most people in many parts of the world didn't live in countries as we understand them today. They thought of their identity primarily in terms of the people they were from, right? For example, looking at Nigeria, people might have identified as being members of the Igbo people, right? And in the result of colonialism was that the British, in that case, imposed countries on them, right? The colonizers drew a line on a map and said, this country is Nigeria now, and brought people who were, culturally and ethnically quite different together and told them, now you're all in one country. Well, one of the ways they responded is by developing a national identity. They developed an artistic and literary movement. They developed a sense of unity as Nigerians, and that nationalism was essential for then kicking out the British later when they pushed back and claimed the country for themselves. And so most of the countries in the world today are the result of colonialism. Some of them disastrously so. In fact, if you look at some of the most dangerous hotspots in the world today, think the India-Pakistan border, Israel, Palestine, those were drawn on a map by English colonizers. Okay, a really important part of colonialism is cultural colonialism. And this is the belief that European culture is better. This is a commonly held belief still today. You will find lots of people on the right in America who argue for some version of European superiority. Often this overlaps with Christian superiority. And the argument went something like this. And to be clear, I don't believe this. I'm just saying it so that you can understand the position that they took. They argued that, look, European culture was clearly better. Europe had all the great composers, right? Mozart and Bach were European. It had the great writers. Shakespeare was a European, right? It had the great philosophers, Plato and the Greeks and the Romans, and they saw Europe as, the place where civilization had been advanced and developed and created beautiful art and beautiful ideas and complex systems. And they looked on the rest of the world as being backward, as being inferior, as being, little removed from animals, as not having developed these, sophisticated ways of creating art and music and culture and ideas and societies. Now, this is entirely wrong. There are, in fact, religions all over the world which are as sophisticated and beautiful and spiritual and uplifting as the European religions, which of course actually come from the Middle East, not Europe at all. And there is art and music and philosophy practiced all over the world and has been traditionally in these cultures long before the Europeans showed up. And a lot of this was just based on prejudice. Europeans saw people who wore clothing as being more advanced and civilized than people who didn't, despite the pretty obvious fact that the reason lots of people in Central Africa didn't wear much clothing is because it's really hot on the equator, right? And this was incredibly harmful, this idea. It meant that colonialism could be justified not just as, taking wealth, which it was, but as really doing something nice for the people there. And we call this attitude benevolent paternalism. Paternalism you might recognize as being similar to patriarchy. Again, it comes from this idea of the father. Benevolent means good and helpful, basically. So the idea here is that the Europeans were acting as parents to people in the global south who they saw as being like children, as unable to take care of themselves, as unable to live as sophisticated and advanced lives as Europeans had. And so they really needed the help of Europeans to lead them to the modern age. And incredible cruelty was done in the name of this, right? For example, in the US, we created a system of schools that we forced Native Americans to go to. We literally kidnapped children from their parents, took them to these Christian schools. They were not allowed to use their given name, their name that their parents had given them. They were not allowed to follow their tribal identity. They were given Christian names. They were beaten and abused if they didn't follow these Christian traditions. They were forced to, not wear the clothing of their family and so forth. And they were told that where they had come from, that their ancestors were inferior, were something to be rejected. And of course, as will happen if you indoctrinate children, in some ways, many of them started to believe it, right? And this has caused generational trauma that is horrific to cultures that this was done to by force and by cultural power. And it was all done by people who told themselves, at least, that they were helping, that they were doing something useful, right? And particularly we see this in Christianity and the missionary movement. And look at the way the missionary on the right of this picture has rested his hand on this child's head, right? They saw themselves as doing, and missionaries today still do, see themselves as doing a favor for people who are backward. An extreme example of this, there was a story recently in this time of global pandemic where Christian missionaries are still trying to contact peoples in the Amazon rainforest who haven't had contact yet with Western civilization to bring them what they see as the superior religion. Of course, there's a dramatic risk that they will bring with them diseases and harm, but they don't think of it that way, right? The people that are invading these cultures. Colonialism also had a lot to do with gender. Rape was used as a weapon by colonizers. We're going to talk about this a lot more in the context of American slavery later in the semester, I think next week. We have here depicted Christopher Columbus. Now, when we talk about Christopher Columbus in US culture, he's often praised, of course, in schools. There has been some recognition recently of the harms that he caused, but I don't think we recognize just how terrible he was as a human being. He systematically raped young girls in the cultures, in the islands that he invaded and controlled. He would kidnap them and hand them out to his subordinates as prizes. Right? This is all documented by De las Casas, who was a monk who was there on the trips with Columbus. He cut off limbs from the native peoples that didn't provide enough wealth for him, that didn't extract enough wealth fast enough for his taste. There was also a cultural production of the idea that men and women were different in gendered ways in the global South. And we have an example here of, I can't say her name properly, but I'm going to try, Saartjie Baartman. She was a member of the group of people who are referred to sometimes as the Hottentot people. And this is, an artist's depiction of her. You shouldn't assume that it was accurate, because what they saw was that women in particular, in these countries were physically different. In particular, they were very interested in her larger buttocks and her larger labia. As they saw it, they saw this as a sign that she was, and people of her group were more sexual, were more lascivious, were, more like animals in their sexual behavior. And she was treated as a subject, right? As being this like scientific curiosity. She was brought to Europe, where she was displayed, and people would pay money to come look at her buttocks and look at her labia and think about how, different she was. And this created this sense that there was this fundamental difference between European white women and, savage and exotic and different African women, that went into justifying all kinds of abuse about them, to them, and treatment of people around the world as being not fully human, right? And at the same time was created this idea that the men in the global South were backwards, were less civilized, treated their women uniquely badly, were, barbaric. Again, this is colonizers who were describing local men this way and saw themselves as saving the women of these countries from the men that were so terrible. We, again, still see this rhetoric today. We saw it in the Afghanistan war and still see it, the idea that Afghani women need saving from the terrible Muslim men who are abusing them. And that's not to say that there certainly has been bad treatment of women around the world by men around the world. But the point is that the Europeans positioned themselves as the saviors. They positioned the women in these countries as unable to help themselves. I don't know why I'm using the past tense here. They position the women as unable to help themselves, as useless, and that they need the Europeans or the Americans to ride in, kill the dangerous men from these countries and protect their women. Starting roughly at the Second World War, there was a global process of decolonization where a bunch of the countries throughout the European countries that had colonized them in various ways, some by war, some by different strategies, famously Gandhi with nonviolence in India. And in lots of ways, this is still an ongoing process. Lots of the wealth, I talked about debt, right? The way that they'd set up these systems of debt. A lot of the natural resources in these countries are still controlled by European and American countries. Which brings us to neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is complicated, but I'm going to do it quickly here. It's the name for the current system that is post-colonial. That means colonialism in its classic form has ended. The vast majority of the countries in the world are independent now. There's still a few colonies, but mostly most places are ruled locally. However, the system of global capitalism, the system of power, is still very much the same as it was under colonialism. All those systems were set up to extract wealth from the global south and move it to the global north. And those systems are still very much in place, and wealth is still very much moving in that direction. And the global wealth gap continues to increase. And if you think about the countries that are in power in the world today in terms of military power and economic power and political power, overwhelmingly they're those European countries, or in the case of the US and Canada, the descendants, settler nations from colonialism. And so, in summary, the colonial power balance has been maintained even though the formal system of colonialism has ended. Another legacy of colonialism is immigration patterns. The result of colonialism, as I said, is that the settler countries and the colonizing countries, so Europe and the US, are dramatically richer than the countries that were colonized. And the simple fact is, if you are born in a rich country, if you grow up in a rich country, you are far more likely to do well in life. You're far more likely to be successful and comfortable than if you were born in a country in the global south. That's obviously, a generalization. It's not true of everyone, but in general, even if you don't do very well relatively in America, you will end up a lot better off than even people that do very well in much of the global south. Right? And so understandably, parents throughout history all over the world want the best for their children, right? And so what they want is for their children to grow up in rich countries where they know their children are more likely to be successful. And so they move to those countries and they're willing to risk their lives. They're willing to risk everything for that because they know the difference is so significant. This is entirely a rational decision by these parents. So our current immigration crisis, such as it is really the result of colonialism, is the legacy of this system.